Hi everyone. In this session we're going to be having a look at conforming red media using Final Cut Pro XMLs. To illustrate this, I'm going to start off inside of Final Cut Pro, and here I've got a new project. In order to start working with the red media, you need to ensure that the red code installer for Final Cut has been installed on the system in order for you to work with the QuickTime files that come from the red camera. To start off, what we'll do is we'll simply go into the bin and we will bring in the QuickTime files from the red media. So we would simply navigate to the file path where the red media is located. You will notice that the file structure that I've got here is exactly the same as the red camera, and you shouldn't reorganize this when you're working with this red media. You can see straight away that the R3D files are not accessible to Final Cut Pro. However, the QuickTime files are. So if I was to select the particular type of resolution I want to work with, so we're going to work with the medium-sized proxies, when I load it in, it appears into the Final Cut Pro bin. You can see the naming convention we've got. You'll also see that the time codes that were actually set up when the red file was actually being shot, you can see that it's been applied there into the column. And if we spool a little bit further down, we can also get to a point where we can see the real name is actually based on the file itself. So these two things are very important, the real name as well as the timecode information, which will make the conform successful. In order for me to start editing, once I've imported in one or two or however many files you need, you simply drag and drop them onto the timeline, and it will either give you an option to set the settings to the clip. If I hit yes, it will then allow me to start working directly with that media. The key thing when doing conforms and working with red media and bringing it into the creative finishing solutions is the tape name and timecode need to match. So even if you're exporting an XML, this data comes across quite clearly. Now what I've got here is just simply a timeline which has got exactly the same material, it's just been edited together. So we've got different shots with different people. Now what we would like to go ahead and do is take this media, which refers to the exact media I've just imported, and bring this into Smoke or Flame and use the media straight away as part of that conform. In order for us to do this, we simply go ahead and we select the file or the sequence that we want to export. And I'm simply going to tell Final Cut Pro to export out an XML. With XML exporting, we support version 2 when it comes to exporting out an XML. What you need to do is ensure that include master clips outside selection is not turned on, and you can choose whether or not you actually save your project when you go ahead and export. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm simply going to go ahead and save the XML within the vicinity of the red media. So you can see this is the red media, this is where the files are kept, and then I've got a separate XML directory which is also here, and I'm simply going to call this the red creative cut. We can then save this, and then it exports out an XML that I can then use inside of Smoke or Flame. Let's go ahead and switch over into Smoke, and inside of Smoke what we're going to go ahead and do is simply go into the library, and inside of the library we now need to start bringing together the elements in order to build the conform. The first step in conforming red media with an XML is to first go ahead and create a connection to the location where the XML and the media are located. The way that we do this using 2011 is to go to the Network tab, and inside here this exposes out all the network systems that are available to you. So for each system you're working on, you will effectively have the storage, the local storage that we're working with, and you'll also have the gateway. And the gateway by default is normally highlighted up. This gives me access to other volumes that may exist on the network. So if I'm working with a SAN or a NAS or some type of share, I'm able to access it through this way. What you can also do is you can also go ahead and store selection sets or bookmarks as to where the media is located. So for example, I know that my media is located in a specific location, so I've simply created a selection set that points to this. Once you have highlighted it, this basically means that that particular region of the network is now exposed into the database of Smoke or Flame. When I come out of this network panel, you will see now I'm looking at my default library where there's nothing in there, but if I open up this pop-up window, you can see that we have access to the gateway. The gateway is what allows us to see other directories and file systems outside of our database. You will see straight away that it says volume storage blog red, so that is where the material is located. If I go in there, you will see I've got two directories. The first one is the XML that we created. The second directory is the red media. So you can see how we're simply browsing through this media. Now when I open up the red directory, you will see that I now have 4 clips. if I select one of the clips, what you're in fact selecting is the actual R3D file. We are not referring back to the QuickTime files that were created from the Red camera. In order for me to see this as well, what we could also do is we can simply take this and swipe over to the right. This will reveal the viewer. Inside the viewer here, you can see it tells me all the metadata of this file, and I can show you this is also pointing directly to an R3D file. And if you scroll down, we can see all the various different bits of metadata that have come from that camera. In order for me to actually start really defining exactly how the conform is going to take place, the first thing to do is actually to double click on the Red file. This will bring up the import settings for R3D files. Inside here, you can actually define how the file is imported. Normally the default settings will be sufficient, but just in case you're wondering, you can do things like set the tape name from the header or the directory, or use primary timecode, edge timecode, or time of day. More importantly, you have the options to do debayering. Now, if I have this clip selected, you will notice here in the metadata panel that the resolution of this media that I'm currently looking at says 1024 by 576. This is simply just a quarter debayer resolution. This does not really apply to the XML because the XML is simply just a cut list. However, when we go ahead and build a timeline, we will need to be specific to the timeline as to what resolution it will be so that our media will match. This will come later into play when we actually build the conform. Down here in the debayering list, let's say for argument's sake I wanted this to possibly be half good. You can see that I've changed a setting for the import. However, it is not updated here in the list and it's not updating on the clip. What you need to do is as soon as you make any changes here, you simply click refresh selected, and once you've done this, this will then reflect the actual settings that that clip will be imported in with. So always remember, once you've made any changes here to your rules, you simply hit refresh selected. The other thing is any changes you make to your rules, you can also save them as presets to be reused afterwards. Now when it comes to red, you can also control the color settings that come from the camera. So for example, the default setting is to use the camera's color settings. You could also go ahead and use RSX settings or even user settings. One thing to point out is if settings do not exist for a clip, so for example, let's say I switch this to RSX settings and I refresh selected, if the image goes checkerboard, this basically means that that data does not exist for that clip. So for example, if I set it back to camera and I refresh selected one more time, you can see that the media will then appear again. You need to ensure that you've got the correct metadata required in order for the clip to be interpreted correctly for the software. If we set it to camera, you can see that the buttons beneath are grayed out. If I set this to user settings, these options then become available, where I can go ahead and tweak all the settings of the red media based upon whatever red defines as its media structure. So let's go ahead and set this back to camera, and I'm simply going to refresh the selected one more time. So now I know for this particular piece of footage exactly what settings are going to be applied to it in order for me to work with this. We can also see the different types of firmware and, as I mentioned before, the metadata. However, one area we need to focus on is actually building up the conform. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and switch to a dual view. So on the top half of the screen, we've simply got the gateway being exposed. So we are actually reading the red files natively through the gateway. And then down here, I've got an empty clip library. So in order to do the conform, the first thing we need to do now is go over to the FCP, XML, and AAF importing tool. And over here, you have two options to look at. The first thing is known as the metadata options. This simply controls the way the timeline's own resolution is going to be defined. So for example, the clip resolution in fact refers to the timeline's resolution. So if inside that timeline in Final Cut you had set it up to be standard definition or high definition, when you export the XML actually remembers the resolution that you had created it inside of Final Cut. However, with red, because you can obviously set the settings of the resolution to be whatever you want, it's completely flexible, you can go ahead and redefine what that resolution of that timeline will be. So for example, if I open this option up, you can see I can now define whatever I want the resolution of my timeline to be. In other words, ignore the resolution of the timeline set in Final Cut and let Smoke or Flame define what those settings shall be. Now remember, I've set up all the debarring and quality settings inside of this particular clip. As I mentioned, the timeline here is a 2K red media file. So we want the timeline to be using the same resolution. With the clip selected, I simply click Copy Selected Clip. This will basically go ahead and add in the resolution details for me. So I don't have to manually enter in the values, I just know that my timeline will now be conformed using these particular settings. This is quite important because obviously you want your footage to be exactly the same as the timeline. The next options we have is the media options. This media options is where we would go ahead and define what the search criteria would be to define our media that will then connect to the timeline. So for example, we can search on various things such as file name, tape name, timecode, MUID, as well as resolution. You also have got the file options in order for you to go ahead and search for the media as well as link to those files once they've been imported. So let's go ahead and create the conform. The first thing is you'll notice that the default behavior of the search criteria is always defaulted to file name. So if I was working with a Final Cut Pro timeline using QuickTime media and I wanted to conform directly to that QuickTime media, I can simply say use the file name. However, we want to conform to a different type of media other than what is actually listed inside the XML. So inside the XML it says QuickTime files. In this case we want to ignore the QuickTime files and rather search for a source that contains timecode as well as a tape name information embedded in the file. So we don't have to worry about what media format it is, we simply want to find tape name and timecode. Now what you can go ahead and do here as well is you can also filter via various different properties. So for example, we can filter to search only for red files and use their tape name and timecode option. Since I know that this is not really an issue with this media, all I've got is QuickTimes and red media, I'm just going to turn that filter off because it will simply search for the particular files that are tape name and timecode at the resolution I'm specifying. So remember, the QuickTime proxies are at a different resolution to my final conform that I'm going to be building. I also have the option to do things like consolidation as well as save the source separately. So if the timeline gets built, I can have all the sources saved out in 2 separate clips, but this may not be necessary for what you need to do. So let's go ahead and select the XML. Now the first thing to note is when you are conforming, it is advisable to have the XML more or less within the region of the media. I did mention this earlier, but the reason being is that when Smoke or Flame does a conform, it searches around the XML to try and locate the media. Now looking in the directory structure I've got here in the gateway, the red directory could be considered as the top directory or my root directory. And inside there I've got 2 subdirectories. I've got the XML directory and then I've got the other media directory which contains my red media. So when I go ahead and build a conform with an XML, what would typically happen is as I drag and drop this, it will always search within the directory that it's looking in. So for example, if I just try and hit conform this XML without adjusting a setting, it wouldn't find anything. However, what we needed to do is we need the XML to go ahead and search above its level of directory where it's at. So for example, we needed to literally step back up to the root level and then search recursively downwards. In order to do this, under the search criteria, you can see there's something called max up 0 level. What this effectively means is as the XML is conforming, we want to have it actually step up another directory and then search recursively down to all the subdirectories that are in that vicinity. So in this case, I'm simply going to say, right, look up 1 level when doing the conform. When we go ahead and take the XML, we want to go ahead and conform this. To do the conform, you simply pick up the clip on the pen and then you drag and drop it. So drop it from one view to the other, and when you release, the XML will then go ahead, rebuild itself, and it will also find the red media. Bearing in mind, once again, if I select this file, you can see that the data then appears for me straight away. If I load up this timeline here onto the Smoke desktop, and we go ahead and expand out our timeline, you can see that it's actually built up the timeline for me, and it is also referring to the red media. Notice the resolution is a 2K file format based on the red file, and as well as the timeline itself, when I click on it as well, it's also based on the same resolution as well. This is how you would go about building your conform from Final Cut Pro using red media. There are different factors that could influence the conform, which you may need to look into, but ultimately this would be the most straightforward way of editing inside of Final Cut Pro using the QuickTime files from the Red camera and then conforming in either smoke or flame using the actual R3D media, setting the debarring settings to what you need, and then building and conforming a successful timeline.